Hey there, Joel here from cosinesound.com.au. Thanks for joining me today. Here's a sneak peek at some of the drones that we will create in this video. In this video, I thought I'd look at a drone today, which is a very interesting and prominent technique in music production and sound design, which it's basically a sustained note or a droning soundscape. And I'd like to draw attention to this question that I looked at about, it was actually 3 years ago, and I posted this answer on Stack Exchange regarding how to synthesize droning strings. And the questioner asked how to synthesize something like a timbre because of the interesting timbre variation. And I'd like to really emphasize the timbre variation is really where a lot of the interest comes from in a drone sound. And so I posted this answer, which thankfully people found helpful. So really described how the timbre is rich because there is actually not only one note, but there's two notes, which creates an array of harmonics. And you can read more about this in the link in the description, which I'll post, but today we'll definitely look at some practical examples in Absynth, which I find to be one of the most easiest ways to really build a drone sound. So I'm really going to build up this drone sound, and there are, there's like a million ways to really create drones. Not all drones have to be the same, but because they are a sustained sound, there's really an infinite variety of ways to do it. And in this case, what I'm going to do is just focus on the timbre of the sound and just build it up to a very large degree by using a lot of different oscillators. Get a really nice ambient drone sound. So I'm really keen. This sounds awesome, by the way. I'm really keen for this. So this will start with a saw wave, and before I do that, let me just play a sound. So I'm going to use the second channel here, which is just a sine wave. So here's a sine wave. And there's a drone sound. That's one harmonic, it's one sine wave. And if I press two notes, it sounds like this. If I add a second voice onto that oscillator, can start to hear some movement happening. It really creates a lot more interest and a lot more movement in the sound, and it's absolutely so simple to do. So let's go back to one note, and now I'm going to just use the spectrum to add some harmonics in. Now remember, we still have two voices. Add some reverb. Really simple. That's just a really quick demo. Now for the main demo, we'll get stuck into it. So here's the sound that I have. I'm using a double oscillator, which I'll explain in a second. So Sawtooth is good foundation of bass and harmonics, and to learn more about creating bass in particular, I've done a video on creating powerful bass sounds. There's a lot of really similar techniques you can apply to drones from that particular video, because all of them relate to a fundamental frequency. So similarly, we've got an array of harmonics that are according to that fundamental frequency, which is, in this case, C, which is about 75 Hertz. So double oscillator is, you can quickly transition. Modulating the balance on that second oscillator like that. Got an etherizer effect. In particular, there's a lot of scattering on the etherizer, and we've got random pitch to create some diffusion, some diffused sound, or some, some more warmth in the sound. So really we can hear this fundamental frequency, and then, but obviously we can hear all the other tones happening. The other tones are really creating the interest in the sound, and the variation as it phases. You see it phasing up and down, and we've also got the LFO modulating between first and the second wavetable here. So if I just turn the LFO off I can just show you what the second wavetable is by itself. This is interesting because the way I've left this at the moment, we're hearing this bass sound, we're hearing a harmony here, which is the 8th harmonic, just by itself, and of these obvious gaps here are very obvious to our ear. We've also got this buzzing sort of chirpy sound, which also we associate with that drone sound because they are all related to that fundamental frequency. But somehow, because of these gaps, we're still able to distinguish the sound, but obviously they are very mysterious, sort of seemingly unrelated tones, because I mean very few sounds come across this way, but you can really just obviously in this section we can't really pick out the individual frequencies, but if I do this, now have a sort of a bright whistling sound. So that'll just sit in the background there. And there's really 100 ways to do that. I'd like to add another oscillator for sort of like an even more texture in the sound, which this one gives a bit of a noisy sort of texture. And you can see this obviously doesn't sound as bassy, but and it is actually a higher octave than the previous bassy sound. So if we add these two together, now this is nice because a higher octave is sometimes an interesting way to emphasize the note without it becoming just about bass itself. So whereas here this focus seems to be focused around bass, but now with this second octave now seemingly has a lot more sort of power in it, that it's almost as though the higher octave is the fundamental sound and it's got extra bass sort of driving it through. So we can sort of diffuse the texture though, because it's a static sound, so we can increase the voices and then diffuse it a bit more by adding unison. Just remember that the sound is, it's got a lot of movement, so it's a really nice drone as it is, but if I take out the movement, it's really not much happening. So just adding an extra voice to the bass to get the bass moving, and then a lot of diffusion on the main textural sound, plus reverb. This reverb or granular synthesis gives a lot more warmth to the sound because it's mixed up high, and it's got a little bit of feedback on the grains, and the boominess of that bass sound is not actually coming through because it's been filtered out by the high pass filter. The third oscillator is another frequency modulated sound. It's also an odd, it's also a square wave, so we've also got odd harmonics. We've got a lot more odd harmonics than the previous oscillator. So it's a very bright sound now. So the drone is obviously taking up the whole spectrum here, and but because that area is a very bright area, you can obviously move that around differently than you would with the main fundamental frequency. You could maybe modulate this a little bit differently, but the odd harmonics also give a bit more space in the sound because they are not adding a lot of octave harmonics, I might say, although the FM index is actually creating more complex sidebands in there, but for the most part I'm pretty sure that this is not adding extra you can see that the bandpass filter has filtered out most of the sound anyway. So kind of got low, mid and high oscillators there. One of my favorite modules now is going to be placed on the master bus, and that is the comb filter. Now what we can do now is really extraordinary because the comb filter is on, as I said, on the master bus there, or the master section, in which a feedback loop is now going to be placed over the whole sound. And if you've watched my comb filter videos, you'll understand that the comb filter is going to be tuning the sound to a particular frequency. Now this is really extraordinary, so I'll just demo this. So I'm holding down a C note, and this is tuned to a 7th in proportion to the root note I'm pressing. So setting it to a transposition setting will relatively tune the comb filter. Notice that when it is tuned to the fundamental, which is 0 or -12 or +12, it's going to resonate very strongly, so you've got to be careful of the feedback. But in other cases, tuning it outside the fundamental can get away with a higher feedback. bandpass filter on that high tune sound is moving. What I really like is actually moving the tuning. The overall tuning can also be moved. So you can move that with this LFO, which I've actually set to about 51 seconds. I use these LFOs. I think these are one of the fastest ways to create drones, but don't forget that in Absynth you've got 64 breakpoints to add into the timeline here. It could really just go on and on once we hold down the notes, so we can absolutely just create really deep sounds. But in this case, I'm creating a basic movement with the LFOs. So in this case, let's just move the comb filter very slightly and very slowly. Another thing I haven't done is create a bit of depth with the envelope. Let's ramp up the low frequencies first and then followed by the higher notes, just very basically. Now the beautiful thing is also that you've got all these notes to use independently, so actually they're not independent, but they can be added. So let me just add a C and a sharp. It's really intoxicating. And another prominent technique is to use reverb. So here's a reverb channel I've got set up with this really beautiful reverb by Flux and Urcam, which is called Verb version 3. This one I've got 8 seconds of reverb with early reflections, cluster, but prominently I've turned the reverb up to about negative, about, yeah, unity, about 0 dB. Apologies about the clipping there, but basically there's so much you can do. I've actually got one more trick to do, which is the LFO 3, which you can modulate at obviously more interesting shapes. So I've set that to that really nice harmonic, spiky sort of harmonic that we've got coming up at the upper end of the spectrum, and that we'll modulate that sort of fast and then slow and then fast and then slow by using the LFO rate. So I've got it set to very fast, and then I'll be taking the LFO rate all the way down every 10 seconds
in the shape of a sine wave.
So here's an example. One more thing we can look at is the organ sound has just got, it's basically just a fractal, which is one of those fractalized waves which you can see the wave duplicating itself in iterations. It's not actually a very complex sound. Not a lot of overdriven sound there, but yeah, I hope you really enjoyed this. Really cool didgeridoo sound came out of that. I didn't even realize. That mainly came from this hollow feedback, I believe. So yeah, thanks for joining me again for this video. Might do another one of these. It's been so awesome. Thank you, and I'll catch you in the next one.